Chapter 48. A person's dust too. This was the agreement he had made with Xu Qing. He had to buy the ingredients. Xu Qing didn't refuse, but he paid even more rent. It was as though this was how he got along with Captain Lei. On this date, Captain Lei returned earlier than usual. Xu Qing had just finished cleaning up the kitchen when he returned with some meat. He smiled at Xu Qing and started cooking. Just like before, Xu Qing sat at the side and studied. However, as he watched, he felt that something was amiss if this continued. The time for dinner would be brought forward and it wouldn't be in the evening anymore. After realizing this, Xu Qing understood something in his heart. He looked at the busy Captain Lei and wanted to say something but hesitated. In the end, he fell silent. As usual, Captain Lei chatted as he cooked. During this short period of time, before dusk arrived, the dishes were already cooked. After placing them on the table, Captain Lei looked at the silent Xu Qing and patted his head. "Kid, I've already bought the right to enter Santao City. I'll pack my luggage later. I'll be leaving tomorrow morning." Captain Lei picked up the wine he had bought for him for a long time and took a big gulp. Xu Qing's movements were stiff. After a moment of silence, he lowered his head and spoke softly. So soon, Captain Lei didn't speak. After a long time, he laughed. "Actually, I've bought it a long time ago, but I didn't tell you. You don't have to be so reluctant. In this world, there's no banquet that doesn't end." As Captain Lei spoke, he took another big gulp of alcohol. "Come, let's eat." Xu Qing looked at the aged Captain Lei and silently picked up his chopsticks to eat. The food today should be very delicious, but it no longer had any taste in Xu Qing's mouth. Captain Lei watched all of this and sighed softly in his heart. However, he still wore a smile on his face as he talked about the trivial matters on the campsite. After the time it takes for an incense stick to burn out, Xu Qing suddenly spoke. "Aren't we going to wait for Cross and Lu One Tooth? They should be back soon. In not waiting anymore, if I return, I'll probably end up like you, adding to my sadness. Besides, if you have time in the future, just come and visit me." Captain Lei took out his pipe and took a puff. The smoke he exhaled covered his expression, making him look a little hazy. Captain Lei finished this meal very quickly. Even after he left to pack his luggage, Xu Qing still sat there silently. He looked at the food on the table and couldn't eat anymore. After a long while, he stood up. This was the first time he didn't wash the bowls and chopsticks. Instead, he went straight to Captain Lei's room. "Are you really leaving?" Xu Qing asked softly. "Don't be so sad. I'm going to stay in the city. You should be happy for me." Captain Lei laughed and called Xu Qing over to help him fold his clothes. Xu Qing walked over silently. He first washed his hands carefully before folding them neatly. With his help, Captain Lei's luggage was packed very quickly. He didn't want most of his stuff and left them for Xu Qing. "This house is also yours. I'll pay the rent," Xu Qing said seriously. Captain Lei smiled when he heard that, but he didn't talk about this topic. Instead, he pulled Xu Qing over and sat there. As time passed, he told Xu Qing about the characters of the scavengers at the campsite. He also emphasized on the camp leader. The camp leader of the campsite isn't a simple person. His background is the Diamond Sect. As for the Diamond Sect, it is the #1 faction in this large area. Dozens of cities and campsites are under their control. Their ancestor is even a Foundation establishment expert. In the future, you have to be vigilant against him at all times when you are here. At that point, it was already very late at night outside. Xu Qing noticed the fatigue on Captain Lei's face and silently stood up to leave. Looking at his figure, Captain Lei sighed softly after a long time. This night was also the first night Xu Qing didn't cultivate during this period of time. He sat there and stared blankly at the night sky outside until he saw the first rays of dawn. It passed so quickly, as Xu Qing mumbled, a sense of melancholy filled his heart. He didn't leave the room at this time like he usually did. Instead, he waited until he heard the sound of Captain Lei opening the door before he slowly walked out. The first rays of the morning sun scattered down. The old and young people in the courtyard looked at each other. "Kid, in leaving." After a long time, a smile appeared on Captain Lei's face. "I'll send you off." "No need. Hurry up and go to class." "I'll send you off." I'll send you off." Xu Qing looked at Captain Lei and reiterated. Captain Lei looked at Xu Qing. After a long while, he revealed a helpless expression and nodded. Just like that, The two of them, one old and one young, left the campsite in the early morning while the other scavengers were still unconscious. When they passed by Grandmother Bai's tent, Xu Qing ran over. Grandmother Bai hadn't arrived yet, and the youth, Chen Feiyuan, wasn't around either. Only Tingyu was there, carrying the medical books on her back. "I'll have to trouble you to help me apply for a day off." After seeing Tingyu, Xu Qing quickly spoke up. He then bowed and turned to leave. Tingyu was a little surprised. When she walked out, she saw Xu Qing and Captain Lei's departing figures. The light of the rising sun shone on the ground, illuminating the area in front of Xu Qing and Captain Lei. It also enveloped their figures as they moved further and further away. On the way, Xu Qing took the baggage from Captain Lei and carried it on his back in silence. Captain Lei had mixed feelings as he looked at the stubborn youth. He wanted to talk about the trivial matters of the campsite's neighbors as usual, but after a few sentences, he couldn't continue. In the silence, the two of them walked into the mountain where they had come from and to the place where they had once rested. At that time, it was also the two of them. Captain Lei stood tall and straight in front while Xu Qing cautiously followed behind. The former was as profound as a sword, while the latter was as reclusive as a wolf. Today, Xu Qing was at the front while Captain Lei was at the back. The former was tall and straight like a mountain peak, while the latter was in his twilight years. Here, under Xu Qing's insistence, he carried the old Captain Lei, just like back then in the jungle. Captain Lei sighed softly in his heart. He looked at the side profile of the youth in front of him and spoke softly after a moment of silence. "After this, you have to pay more attention to those scavengers on the campsite. I know that your combat strength is very strong now, but you can't underestimate them. Scavengers are desperados. To them, unscrupulous means are a common occurrence. At night, don't forget to feed those dogs. These little fellows are the most trustworthy ones on the campsite. Also, you have to remember to eat. Don't eat cold food. Don't find cooking or heating troublesome. Eat it after it's hot. You're still growing, so you can't be careless. Otherwise, when you get older in the future, you'll know how tough it is. Oh right, don't sleep on the bedboards in the future. Don't be afraid of dirtying the bedding. Remember to bask in the sun after you're done bathing." And Captain Lei spoke softly. His words were fragmented and contained deep concern. Xu Qing carried Captain Lei on his back and nodded lightly, memorizing the other party's words. As Captain Lei spoke, he fell into a deep sleep due to his weak body. As he listened to the snoring behind him, Xu Qing's footsteps also became gentler. He tried his best not to jump. Even if he had to take a detour, he would maintain a steady pace. Just like that, he walked through the wilderness with Captain Lei on his back and bypassed the basin. When dusk arrived, as the sky darkened, their silhouettes were elongated from the corner of his eyes. A city then appeared before Xu Qing's eyes. It was also at that moment that Captain Lei woke up. He looked at the city gate and spoke softly after a long time. "We're here." Xu Qing let out a soft "uh" and felt a tightness in his chest. Under Captain Lei's request, he gently put him down. After taking the baggage from Xu Qing, Captain Lei looked at the city gate and then at Xu Qing. After a moment of silence, he smiled and lifted his hand to stroke Xu Qing's head, messing up his hair a little. "Kid, you can go back now. If you miss an old man like me in the future, you can come over anytime. I live in the southern part of the city, on Xu Qing Road, with the number 3. With that, Captain Lei took his luggage and walked toward the city gate. Xu Qing stood there and looked at Captain Lei, who was walking further and further away. He had so many things to say in his heart, but he didn't know what to say. He could only stare blankly. It wasn't until he reached the city gate and submitted his entry permit that Captain Lei suddenly turned his head. He cast a deep glance at Xu Qing and waved his hand. Under the urging of the city guards, he walked into the city and disappeared. Xu Qing's expression was desolate. He waited for a very long time. When dusk fell and the city gate closed, his heart instantly felt empty. "Take care." After a long while, Xu Qing mumbled and turned around bitterly. The feeling of loneliness once again filled his entire body. As night fell, his lonely figure was gradually covered. He walked toward the wilderness alone, toward the basin alone, and toward the mountains alone. Further and further.